Sri Aurobindo is describing the process by which we have to purify the understanding, the buddhi, its lower functioning as well as its higher functioning. And in the present passage we are reading, the focus is on purifying the lower functioning of the buddhi, which is the part of the intellect which we are normally used to utilizing when we think deeply about things. The purification itself, Sri Aurobindo explains, is a removal of the confusion of working. All impurity, he says, is a departure from the just and inherent right action of things, that is the dharma, in which the just, in which the right action is pure and helpful to our perfection, and the departure from this right action is the result of an ignorant confusion of dharmas, that tendencies belonging properly to other parts and functions are mixing into this functioning. So, as far as the buddhi itself is concerned, you will recall he had explained how the pure intellectual understanding consists of disinterested observation, judgment, and reasoning. And it's at least the lower functioning. And for purifying this, the first impurity, the first cause of impurity, is the intermittence of desire in the thinking functions. And the desire itself is an impurity of the will involved in the vital and emotional parts. And for the purification itself, the understanding must lift itself beyond the siege of desire and emotion. And if it has to be perfectly immune, even in lifting up and being free, then those vital parts and the emotions have to be further purified. But as a first step, the understanding can disengage from the emotional mind. And then he explains what is the proper functioning of the vital parts, what is the proper functioning of the heart, and if they are to be purified for the complete purification of the being. He says the will to enjoy is proper to the vital being, but not the choice or not the reaching after the enjoyment. And we discussed this last time, that whatever comes to us, we should be able to enjoy without hankering for what is not, without hankering for what is taken away. As things come, we enjoy. As things go, we also continue to enjoy. This should be the right working of the vital being. Similarly, for the heart, to be freed from subjection to cravings and to be free of false emotions of fear, wrath, hatred, lust, etc. They constitute the chief impurity of the heart, and so to be free of them is the purification of the heart. And the proper functioning of the heart is the will to love. And here also, the choice of love and the reaching after love have to be renounced, and the heart has to be taught to love deeply with intensity, but the depth is to be a calm depth and an intensity which is settled and equal. So all of this involves a kind of a calming, quieting, and bringing of equality in the whole of the nervous being and the heart. And so Sri Aurobindo concluded this with equality, therefore, even as it was the first word of the path of works, so also is the first word of the path of knowledge. And we saw how this becomes later on the foundation also of Sri Aurobindo's own integral yoga, the yoga of self-perfection. So this being the first step for the removal of impurity, the first cause of impurity, we now move to the second cause of impurity. And these causes build upon each other, so to say. If the first cause has not been sufficiently removed, removal of the second and the third becomes much more difficult. One could begin by trying to purify at the level of the second or third causes, but you would find constantly the means that you have to deal with those causes are themselves compromised by the first cause. For example, as we will see later in the, well, let's say in the second cause, where the focus is on the mixture of the sense mind, it's very easy for the desire nature to mix in the attempt to free from the sense mind. It's very easy for the desired nature to bring in a sense of frustration. Oh, I am trying, but I have failed. And I have failed repeatedly. Therefore, I am incapable of doing. And it can go on some kind of a strike or some revolt or reaction. All of these would make the attempt itself extremely difficult. So that's why there's a sequence in the purification. And to the extent that this first cause of impurity has been cleared, the second and the third become much easier because they're more refined. They as if are dependent on the other levels. So the second cause of impurity in the understanding is the illusion of the senses and the intermiscence of the sense mind in the thinking functions. So this is surprising for us because we tend to think of the mind and its relationship with the senses to be something which is quite sacrosanct. The mind trusts the senses. If I see this as green, well, it must be green. And the senses themselves could deceive us, or the mind itself could be completely bound to the senses to the extent that it is unable to conceive of anything beyond what the senses reveal. It may surprise us to know, but the fact is there is a very deep mixture of the sense mind in our higher faculties. I will give a few examples as we go along, but first let's quickly see how he formulates this relationship. He says, no knowledge can be true knowledge which subjects itself to the senses or uses them otherwise than as first indices, whose data have constantly to be corrected and overpassed. The beginning of science is the examination of the truths of the world force that underlie its apparent workings, such as our senses represent them to be. So if it's only when we disengage from the senses that we begin to have what we call science. But that is just a first step. There is a step further. The beginning of philosophy is the examination of the principles of things which the senses mistranslate to us. So this is even a level above science. And then there's a third level. The beginning of spiritual knowledge is the refusal to accept the limitations of the sense life, or to take the visible and sensible as anything more than phenomenon of the reality. So we are actually describing three stages of freeing from the entanglement with the senses. The first stage is the beginning of science. So you can see how far we are, even as a humanity. We respect science greatly, and a large part of the modern education is to inculcate the scientific temperament, which is precisely this, teaching the mind to stand back from the working of the senses and to look upon them, to look at what's behind them. But we can see how the philosophy itself could be taught as a further step above this. Unfortunately, it is not so taught as things are. But as it could be brought into this kind of training, we would see philosophy as something as invaluable to modern education as the scientific temper is to the current values of humanity. And then we would find after that the values which the spiritual knowledge would bring in. And we would find that to be as important as the philosophy, or even more important than the philosophy and the scientific temperament. But this is what is our program now as practitioners of the integral yoga. But first, before even these three are discussed, he describes the relationship of the two. No knowledge can be true knowledge which subjects itself to the senses. If we have any knowledge, the knowledge cannot be true if the knowledge is dependent on sensory information. It sounds strange at first, but when we think about it, we learn very quickly in life not to trust the senses. For example, somebody comes and reports to you, "Oh, do you know such and such a thing happened? Somebody misbehaved with me. This is what he said, this is what I said, and please, I want justice." The first thing we learn in life is don't trust one-sided report. So if we are immature, we would say, yes, you are right, and I take hasty action, and I regret later when I discover things were not as he narrated. So later in life, as I grow more mature, I will say something like, all right, let me study the situation. And in order to study the situation, I must listen to the other side and their views. And after I've heard both views, I must still stand back and investigate to see whether there was a deeper factor to it. This is what we find so fascinating in detective novels, mystery stories, where a set of facts are given to us. The facts are found to be at least superficially correct. And then there is as if a peeling back of layers. You go a little further and you discover, yes, although this fact is true, there is something else against which now this could even be called false. A deeper truth is discovered. And then you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then suddenly you find something in which is so different from what you started with. And that's what makes for the joy and the surprise and the entertainment of a mystery story. But you see, in this whole process, we are dealing still with what the senses show us. But we find there are layers and layers even within that. So true knowledge cannot be true, or rather knowledge cannot be true as long as it subjects itself to the senses, or uses them otherwise than as first indices. The proper role of the senses is to provide a first support, a starting point. And if you don't use the senses as only first starting point, you use them as something more profound, more important, then again you have a problem. And if we accept them as first indices, then their data have constantly to be corrected and overpassed. So we start with the assumption that whatever the senses show us, while superficially correct, there is a deeper correction required, and we have to go beyond what the senses reveal to us and go deeper and deeper and deeper all the way. And you see how this is exactly what science has been doing. It started with very superficial descriptions and understanding of the universe, and then it went on investigating to peel off layers. Now, we take a simple example of miraculous demonstration. You take yellow colored liquid, blue colored liquid, and you mix and you get green colored liquid. And it looks magical because green does not belong to yellow, does not belong to blue. Where has the blue gone? Where has the yellow gone? It has become green. There was a time when a demonstration like this would be entertaining. People would say, wow, this is magical. How did you do it? Or if somebody demonstrated a power that he touched you and your whole body experienced a tingling sensation, you would say, oh, this is magical. You have some extraordinary power. A few years down the line, when the knowledge and understanding of these things grew a little more common, this would be what we would call as kindergarten chemistry. And the tingling sensation, we would say, oh, you have some high voltage electricity. That's an interesting thing, but you would not find it anything surprising because it's familiar to you. You have understood that there are things beyond, more complex. And so the modern human mind itself has, let's say, over the last 200 years, been taught to question and doubt the senses and to look behind it. And so when a magician demonstrates something, he makes a person float in the middle of the stage. You are looking all around. Where are the hidden wires? Is there a mirror hidden below? Where's the trick? And so you have accepted that to have somebody floating in the air on a stage is not the reality. There is something behind it. Now, I found it very interesting to see how the instinct to look behind, the instinct of what is normal and what is not, is actually deeply ingrained and goes at a level which even the trained mind may not be fully aware of. And this is seen in little babies who have barely learned to get familiar with the power of sight. They cannot yet speak. There is obviously very little brain development even to think. And such a child, if he is shown an object which is, or an arrangement which looks impossible, he senses that something is wrong. So one example is to arrange things so that an object is found hanging in midair. And when child is exposed to this, he looks at it, stares, and then either starts crying or is afraid. A 6 months old baby. Why does he start crying? Something is wrong. This is not correct. He knows it. And how does he know it? Obviously, there is a layer deep within of the mind's functioning which can recognize that although my senses reveal this, this cannot be. There is something not all right. He is unable to articulate that. He feels a conflict between two layers within him. And he starts crying or he has fear or whatever, some unusual reaction. So it is almost inherent to our power of true knowledge to not trust the senses and even to rely on something else that knows, which can cut through the senses and show their limitations and even overpass. Overpass means to bypass, to go beyond. And although the senses show me as this object, show this object floating, I go beyond and recognize there is some mechanism by which the object is held up and it is not weightless. So training the mind to correct the senses and to overpass them. This is the first step. And in the beginning of science is the examination of the truths of the world force that underlies apparent workings, such as our senses represent them to be. So here, the way Sri Aurobindo formulates is very beautiful, and it is the yogic approach to science. That science is not merely a kind of an exploration of nature and organizing to put to use a higher knowledge. He says it is an examination of the truths of the world force which underlie the apparent working. There is a world force, a gigantic cosmic energy, and this energy is working. And the working itself is in so many layers. The most superficial of those layers is what the senses reveal to you. And to look behind that superficiality, and then to look behind that, and to look behind that, to understand the working of this world force. And from the spiritual point of view, we would see this world force also as conscious energy, even if it is somnambulist, half asleep energy, it is still conscious energy, even in its origin, a divine energy. And all of the workings which we see, we would only look at it as her free working or her habitual working, which we are now beginning to understand and appreciate, or which she accepts to reveal to us as we go deeper. This would be the yogic approach to science. You can see how it contrasts with the very materialistic science, which says, oh, there is a machinery out there, we have to seize on the machinery and put it to our use and conquer and subjugate nature. So there is even the idea that if we approach the world force and ask her to reveal her secrets, then she can reveal those secrets. Many of the early scientists were often mystics, and this was their approach to understanding, to knowing the world. I have mentioned here before that I met somebody, the head of a spiritual community in Switzerland, who had created a machine which was generating electricity just like that, drawing energy from the environment. He demonstrated it to scientists. And although it seemed so simple in the way he constructed it, nobody could figure out how it works. And he was himself a man who had not gone through formal school education. Most of his education had taken place in the forests while he was meditating or receiving intuitions and so on. So he was asked by them, how did you make it? How did you gain this knowledge? And his explanation was not very convincing, but this is what he said. He said, if you ask nature, then she will reveal to you her secrets. She will teach you how to do things in a better way. She will give you all this knowledge and more knowledge. And the idea of asking nature is somehow strange to the raw materialist scientist. But this is how he discovered or created, invented this device. But this was the approach which many of the mystical scientists have had. And this is how they have made breakthroughs of these kinds. But still, the beginning of the science is this looking for, examining the truths of the world force which are behind the apparent workings, such as our senses represent them to be. So again, there is a indirect hint. There is this working, there are layers, but our senses represent them to us in a certain way. And the senses in the way they represent are already losing things. Let's look at it in a different way now. If we were to be able to go beyond the limits of our senses, we would see the workings of the world in a very different way. If you were to pick up a magnet, our senses would show only the metal shaped in this way. If we had a subtler sight, we would see a certain flow of energy whirling through and around the magnet, which is the magnetism, the power of magnetism. So our senses as they function are already reducing what is at a superficial reality. And this is still, I call superficial reality, to see the energy flow of the magnet, because we can easily represent them. If you put the magnet, if you put a sheet of paper on the magnet and sprinkle iron powder, it will fall into that arrangement to show the lines of magnetic fields. It's as easy as that to be able to perceive those lines. But the deeper layer would ask, what is flowing that the magnetic pieces line up in this way? A still deeper layer would ask, what keeps the flow going? Why doesn't it just dissipate? And so on. So there'll be many layers even beyond. But the first layer itself, the senses misrepresent in a reduced form. So we have learned now to question the senses, to look behind, and then the beginning of philosophy is the examination of the principles of things which the senses mistranslate to us. So while the science began with the apparent workings of the world force which the senses represented, philosophy begins with the principles of things behind. So philosophy asks questions which are as if a level above science. Why at all does the world force function in this way? We say this is a principle. Science says this is a law. Physical objects pull at each other. We call that gravity. And then we create a formula to describe this pattern of the pull, and we say, now we have explained gravity. Newton had this apple fall on his head, and he thought about it, and he said, therefore, Earth pulls the apple. It looks nice, and a day will come very soon when people will look at this science and laugh at its childishness and immaturity. The same way as we laugh at the science of 300 years ago, where the question would be asked in your examination, why is water wet? And the correct answer is, because it is a liquid. We look at this and we laugh at the immaturity of that science. And a few years down the line, they will look at us and say, oh, these people, they were so stupid. They accepted that Earth pulls. How does Earth pull? Why does Earth pull? And if Earth pulls and everything pulls, then why doesn't the whole universe collapse into itself? Why is it found to be expanding instead? Oh yes, our science has created more complex explanations. While the Earth pulls, there is something else which is also pushing. We have not yet discovered that, but we call it dark matter and dark energy. We don't measure it, we can't see it, but it must be there, otherwise things would not be the way they are. It's just a way of fooling ourselves in layers. We make it so complex eventually that science actually becomes unintelligible. Every student of special relativity of Einstein, every student of quantum mechanics comes away tearing his hair in frustration and eventually simply gives up and says, fine, here are formulas, I just apply them. I cannot understand this. In fact, this whole principle of the strange behavior of quantum physics is referred to as quantum weirdness. Because everything is so weird, but you're supposed to somehow accept that that's how it is. And to accept it is to say, I have understood it. Of course, we have understood nothing. It's so weird. It's in fact conflicting our normal experience of the world. And so if that is true, how can you accept it? So the meta level thinking asks, why are things the way they are? Why is gravity pulling? Is gravity the same everywhere? What's the principle behind? What is the cause of the universe? What was the origin of the Big Bang itself? And these are questions which science says are a little bit beyond its purview. So there is a philosophy of science. Philosophy looks back at the way science functions and says, maybe science itself can be done differently. And it approaches things on a higher level of abstraction. So philosophy, the beginning of philosophy, is the examination of the principles of things which the senses mistranslate. Now already here the senses are not merely limited in their working, but they are completely translating wrong. And then above that, another meta level is the beginning of spiritual knowledge. is the refusal to accept the limitations of the sense life, or to take the visible and sensible as anything more than phenomenon of the reality. So the spiritual knowledge begins when we say, yes, the senses have their play, but there are things which our senses are unable to reveal to us. And it's not just electromagnetism, which we can represent by devices which translate, like the iron filings which we sprayed on the magnetic field, or other devices to measure electromagnetic phenomena. There are things which our most sensitive machines cannot measure, but they are as real, or perhaps even more real, than the phenomena which the senses and the material domain can make visible or sensible to us. So the sense life is only a part. And to say that this is all is an error. We refuse to accept that limitation. We look at things further and greater. Sense life is valid as one phenomenon of the greater reality with a capital R. How then do we explore those higher domains of reality? Well, we discover, fortunately, that as human beings, we already participate in those levels in other parts and functions of our being. Our emotions, for example, our thoughts belong to a domain different from the sense phenomena. Therefore, machines are not able to measure our emotions or our thoughts. They can only measure side effects of the emotions on our biology, side effects of our thoughts on the electricity in the brain, and so on. But the thoughts themselves are well beyond, well behind, and are as vivid or more vivid than material processes. I was told this incident by somebody who was briefly a colleague in the ashram, and he said that somebody had come once with a EEG, electroencephalograph, measuring brain waves. He was showing it around in the ashram because this was now the great breakthrough of science. It can measure brain waves, and spirituality is a thing, still a thing, a little abstract, unreal fantasy, speculation, at least to him. So he was going around showing it to people, and he met one of the sadhaks here who had a scientific bent of mind. So he was curious to see this machine. And when they were doing the tests, the sadhak was interested, and then he said, "Okay, let's do one thing." He asked for a child to be plugged into the EEG, and they connected the machine. The waves were showing, and then the sadhak took the child on his lap and smiled at him, and the child smiled back, and immediately the EEG machine's output went completely flat. No brain waves being registered. So this fellow was quite rattled. He said, "What's this? My machine has stopped functioning." So he banged the machine, switched it off, switched it on, flat. And then this sadhak said, "Okay, now it will begin." And immediately all the brain waves started registering on the machine again. So this man was completely freaked out. But he then, basically it was a demonstration to show that while brainwaves measurement are good, it has nothing to do with mind. Mind itself can stand back, and it is even possible to transmit the silence of the mind, as he did obviously to this child. And when his mind went silent, the brainwaves went silent. And that's it. There was nothing more to it. Another incident which I have narrated before here was of a scientist in Calcutta who went to the Himalayas, saw a sadhu there in meditation, went to that man and said, "Why are you wasting your time? Look at what science is doing." And the sadhu had picked up his kamandalu, little pot of water, raised it on the head, in the air, and left it like that, hanging in midair, and said, "Can your science explain this?" So the scientist was shocked. He went back to Calcutta, resigned from his post, and became a disciple of the sadhu. So I was not happy with that idea. I believe he should have worked to bridge the two. But still, the idea being that there is something completely outside the domain, even of science's greatest imaginations, possible in this huge 99% of reality, which is outside the purview of matter and of the visible and sensible sense life. And the beginning of spiritual knowledge is to say that I refuse to accept the limitations of the sense life as all. I accept it just as phenomenon of the reality, and I begin to explore that reality by observing my thoughts, observing my emotions, and then going layer by layer deeper and higher to discover and master those domains. And I find that they are not existing in abstraction, they actually relate to matter and material processes. They are, in fact, the underlying truth of the material processes and can freely modify the material processes, as these examples show. So, all of this is a basic requirement for true knowledge, that the knowledge should not subject itself to the senses. Now, I said I would show some more examples of how we are actually deeply embedded in our subjection to the senses. And this is demonstrated, you could all find it on YouTube now. There is a demonstration done by Darren Brown. He's a mentalist, as they call them, hypnotist or magician who does mental magic, as we call it. What he does is, and it's all shown live on television, he sits with a woman and asks her to point out what is blue and what is yellow. And there are many objects around, and she has just come in a car. I believe, I think it was blue and yellow. The color is irrelevant. I think her car was blue. And then Darren Brown makes her look at the color blue and yellow, and then starts a process of confusing her mind that the blue could be almost like yellow, yellow could be almost like blue. Can you begin to see this and that? And as he speaks, the woman is observing and she says, yes, yes, yes. And within a few minutes, he has already hypnotized her, a mild hypnosis, and taught her mind to switch the two colors. And now she looks at the yellow sheet and says, this is blue. And she looks at the blue sheet and says, this is yellow. And then he takes her out to find her car. And she can't find her car anymore, although it's right in front of her. And then she turns to a car which is the opposite color and says, that's the color of my car. So it's with eyes open. She thinks she's fully conscious, and she is practically functioning normally. The the imprint of the colors have been switched in the sense mind. Now imagine if this is the extent of the unreliability of our senses. How easily the senses could be taught to see differently, to hear differently. And with examples of much deeper hypnosis, you can even make a color invisible. So the color red, for example, let's say orange, would be invisible. You tell the mind that now this color is invisible. The person looks around and he cannot see orange objects. So you look at that and you say, I don't see those, I see nothing there, the flowers are not there. And if somebody, let's say, comes with a sheet of orange paper and places it before his face, he will behave as if there is nothing there, as if the sheet is invisible. He will behave as if he is able to see right through to the objects around. And here's the interesting part. If you try to convince him that he is not actually able to see things, you cannot. He is convinced that he is actually able to see through. And now if you ask him what is behind, he will first describe the things which would have been seen earlier, because his mind retains what is behind. And then if you change what is behind, he gets confused. I'm not sure. I don't know how to describe it. I'm not sure. And his mind goes through some kind of internal confusion. There's a part of the mind which senses that this is not exactly what it should be. And there's another part which is convinced that this is what I'm seeing. and that creates a kind of a confusion. Now, if this is the case for the person who believes he's awake and not under some kind of sleep state of hypnosis or waking hypnosis, then imagine what happens to us. We can, in fact, be very easily programmed to imagine anything, see anything, feel anything. So I was speaking recently to a stage magician who does these mentalist tricks. And he gave a very simple example of which you can try out and test. He says, you take a metal bar and ask somebody to hold one end of it. And the other end, you place an iron, heating iron. Switch it on. Or appear to switch it on. Tell the person you've switched it on, it should not actually be on. And you place this supposedly hot iron on the metal. And obviously now the heat will travel up the iron piece and he's holding the other end. And you just say, well, tell me when it gets warm. That's all the suggestion required. The expectation that it's going to grow warm because a hot object has been placed on the other end. And you say, tell me when it gets warm. And after a while, the person will say, now it's getting warm. And after a while, he'll say, now it's getting warmer. Now it's getting hot. Oh my God, it's getting very hot. You can, of course, feed the suggestion by saying, is it hot yet? Is it hot yet? Can you bear it? So you're putting the suggestion that at some point it's going to become unbearable, and he's actually going to feel it unbearable beyond a point. Now, if you're told this, you will not believe it. But the fact is, this man makes a living performing stage magic like this. And that's how it works. This is the extent to which the sense mind and our intellect, understanding, buddhi are joined. If the senses are given a suggestion, it becomes a reality all the way to the buddhi. And you know, of course, the more extreme forms of this limitation, when people say things like, I will not believe it until I see it. You've heard this phrase so many times. What is this except the buddhi being stuck in the sense mind? That you refuse to accept something to be true just because you have not seen it. Isn't that ridiculous? Why can't it be true? But this is how we have embedded our mind in the senses and programmed ourselves to refuse to accept anything which the senses do not show us. And this is part of the problem of scientists when they are brought face to face with what is called parapsychological phenomena. Tested in the laboratory in the most rigorous conditions, just to look at those results gets them so rattled that they refuse to look at those results. You see, it's very convenient today for scientists to say, oh, these things are not replicable. We cannot test them in the lab. There is no proper formal study. That's not true. For the last 100 years, there have been repeated studies, repeated every few decades in more and more complex and precise measurements, showing all kinds of parapsychological phenomena, to the point where you're achieving performance more accurate than conventional physical processes. The results have been published in journals of parapsychology, but of course they will never be allowed to be published in journals of physics. But the physicist will refuse to look at those journals, refuse to look at that evidence, because simply it means this worldview of my physical senses now is suddenly put into question, and I do not want it. Even in the domain of pure physics, when you will recall about 25 years ago, there were experiments which demonstrated what was then referred to as desktop fusion or tabletop fusion. That in a little glass of water, you had to stick in a few metals and it would produce heat and electricity by a process very similar to fusion. It would revolutionize the whole world of energy. But the first reaction of scientists was, it's not possible. Why? Because it doesn't fit current theory. But if you stood by this as an argument, then we would still be stuck in the theories of 200 years ago. just because it doesn't fit current theory, but current theory has evolved. Why not? Why can't you say, well, here's an interesting effect, let's explore this further? But they refused it, although the Japanese government invested some billions of dollars in exploring this effect. Obviously, when they did that, they had validation in their laboratories. They were very senior labs funded by governments, other governments, which continued to explore this. The only thing they did was they changed the term. They stopped calling it fusion. They now call it low energy nuclear reaction, LENR. And these are still validated. But if you ask a conventional physicist, he'll say, oh, that's not true. It has been proved to be false. And why? Blinkers. Blinkers of the intellect, choosing to focus on a very narrow band of the physical reality. And obviously, true knowledge is impossible under such circumstances. So here's the starting point. We have accepted we need to go further. But the way, the extent to which the two are embedded in each other makes it very difficult to disengage. So for this, Sri Aurobindo says, equally must the sense mind be stilled and taught to leave the function of thought to the mind that judges and understands. So two things are required. The understanding should disengage and refuse to be entangled with the senses, but the senses should not judge anymore and disengage from the power of judgment. The senses should only report. They should only say, this is what I observe. What it means is not the purview of the senses. That the freed understanding should stand back and observe and think, rather than the sense mind just rushing and saying, this is impossible. I have another interesting incident. When this is narrated by Ingo Swann, he is one of those famous psychics who demonstrated in the lab consistently certain patterns of mind effects, and even developed a whole technology to teach others to perform the same things. So when he was first taken to Stanford Research Institute, he was taken to their most advanced machine. And he was told that this is a device which is a quantum detector of magnetic fields. There's something called a Josephson junction, which measures very subtle variations of fields. It was meant to measure some effects of cosmic radiation. So he was taken to this room and he was told, we want you to try to influence this machine. So he looked around. Where is the machine? They said, you're standing over it. He looks down. He's standing on a slab of concrete. Under that slab of concrete is a slab of metal. Under that is a cryogenic device to cool it down to near absolute zero. Within that is a sphere. Within that are layers, etc., all the way to this very tiny sensitive device, which is putting out a signal, which is coming out on this recorder in front of him. And that's all he has as a reference. And he says, but how do you expect me to influence something which I can't see? So after a while he says, all right, let me try to remote view it, to see it with my subtle sight. So he tries to feel what's under him, and he makes out this big circular device, and at the center of it, he picks out the center. And then on the sheet where the signals are coming, he sketches the Josephson junction. And he says, is this what it is that you want me to influence? And as he's drawing it, obviously his mind is connected to it. The readout on the machine went crazy. It just began to shake all over. So he was asked to influence the machine. He was actually influencing it even as he observed it. And the scientists and their assistants there just turned away. And one of them, he says, just turned around and walked out of the room. I laughed because it's so funny. As he walked out, he banged into the wall. He banged into a pillar. Imagine the person is so confused, refusing to see what his senses are showing him. He walks out, he's blanked himself out so much, he's not even seeing what's in front of him. He banged into the pillar. But you see the reaction of the scientists to turn away, shake your head and walk out, blinding yourself completely. because the senses judge that this is impossible. The understanding would be curious, but the senses have already blocked it. This is impossible. And the senses have blinded themselves, refusing to see. His physical sight is no more registering, and he bangs into the pillar. So the training involves now purification of the understanding to separate from the senses, refuse to blindly accept what the senses offer, but equally to train the senses now not to make judgments, not to suddenly switch off and refuse to see. I had another interesting experience. This is now 15 years ago. I was invited to Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore for a lecture, and somehow the person who was organizing it had wrongly posted the notice or the time. So as it turned out, nobody was present, and so he was very embarrassed. And he went around and got a few professors who were sitting 5 p.m. Everyone had gone. A few professors were sitting in their rooms, and he said, "Please come. It's embarrassing for me. Just sit through this lecture." So they all sat there, management professors from 5, 6 disciplines. So I thought I have to recalibrate to their interests. I asked them, "Well, what are your interests?" So somebody said management, somebody said technology, somebody said something else. So I said, okay, I'm going to link them all in one presentation. And I started with something, linked the threads. And eventually they were very happy, they were very satisfied. And then they said, but where's the evidence for something which is beyond the physical? Somehow the discussion came to auras. So I said, well, you should be able to see it. And the interesting thing was all the scientists, management professors were sitting as a group, and others who were not from that background were sitting behind. And I asked them to see. It's very easy if you look a little carefully to notice the haze of the aura around the head. So I tried to get them to see it. Interestingly, everybody of the non-professors could see it. One or two professors looked with interest, their eyes twinkled. One could make out that they're seeing it, but they kept silent. And two of them said, we don't see it, we don't see it. And eventually, after a while, they said, maybe we don't want to see it. Which is a fact. It's when something inside you refuses, you don't want to see it, that you blind yourself to things. So often this happens to us in life. After having the shock of some change of circumstances, we say, I don't know, the signs were always there. I should have known before, but I was blind to it. My trust, my love, my affection, my desire, my keenness to believe blinded me to the fact that such and such a person is not trustworthy or such and such a thing is not true, etc., etc. But so often in life, we find ourselves choosing to be blind because it would go against some strong belief that we have. But that could still be on emotional levels. But at the sensory level, equally, there is this kind of choosing to be blind. So the senses, the sense mind must be stilled and taught to leave the function of thought to the mind that judges and understands. And remember, sense mind observes and brings with it associations, makes comparisons between what it observes and the associations, looks for similarities and differences. Now, these are all part of the functioning of the sense mind. So if your sense mind is clouded and makes a judgment, you observe something, you pull in an association, and you blind yourself to the fact that they are quite different. You choose to see only certain similarities, convince yourself, therefore, this can be trusted, and you move on. When the understanding in us stands back from the action of the sense mind and repels its intermittence, the latter detaches itself from the understanding and can be watched in its separate action. So this is the technique. How do you teach the sense mind not to get involved in judgment? When the judgment stands back and refuses the mixture of the sense mind, then the sense mind itself detaches from the understanding. And now the understanding can watch its separate action and can then will and modify its working, remove from it the mixtures that it brings in. But then what do you see when you observe the sense mind purely, without the mixture of the understanding now involved? It, the sense mind, it then reveals itself as a constantly swirling and eddying undercurrent of habitual concepts, associations, perceptions, desires, without any real sequence, order, or principle of light. It is a constant repetition in a circle, unintelligent and unfruitful. Our best example of this is the state of sleep, or the early state of sleep in which we are, where all the dream impressions come, where you do not have any clear dream structure, just chaotic imprints of things of the day. So something in the morning, did some work and I find myself doing that work. And in the middle of that work now, something else which I had as a thought or a fear pops up and modifies this. And then something else, an association associated with this fear, pops in and modifies this. And you have things pulled one after another and swirling and mixing. It's what we observe if we train ourselves to watch our mind as an observer, and we observe what happens when we daydream. A person daydreaming is doing the same thing. There's a very simple exercise you can do. Take a single word, any word, let's say red. Watch what the mind did immediately. The moment the word red came, there was an association. Perhaps blood, perhaps a flag. From the blood came the picture of a medical test. From the flag perhaps came the association with a particular country or something else. From the medical test, I remember the person, a friend of mine who's going through a medical test, and I think of the person. From that country, another chain happens. You just wander all around. And then suddenly something in the mind pops up and says, oh, but I was supposed to think of red, and jumps back to red and starts a new chain immediately. So remember, the operation of the sense mind is through associations. The moment an association comes, the mind wanders to the next thing, which triggers another association, which triggers another association, and just keep wandering. Constantly swirling and eddying undercurrent. It's moving, swirling, and eddying. There's a round and round process. There's some kind of a center to that round. You don't wander too far away. The picture, the eddy and swirl, is this rotational movement of the water. And it's as if in the sense mind, the substance of the sense mind is dragged to swirl round. And what are the things which pop? Habitual concepts, associations, perceptions, desires. So I am, let's say, a person who is working in the tailoring department, spending, let's say, 6 to 8 hours a day in the tailoring functions. All the mind's habits are associated with that. Those are the habitual concepts which will come into him. His dreams will always have the symbols and associations with the tailoring functions. A person who is working in the accounts department, the habit of his mind is nitpicking, not trusting, verifying, totaling, arranging numbers, rearranging, modifying, and so on. This will be the pattern of his thinking after a while. And if he has not trained his mind to be free or wide, this will creep into his relationships. And he will start nitpicking in relationships. You will see often the kind of job that a person does is the pattern that continues into their human relationships also. Those functions, because they are the habitual forms of the mind, unless the mind has been trained to think differently. This is why the mother wanted in the ashram school that the mind should be given as wide and broad a base as possible, not narrowly specializing, but making plastic by stretching the capacities of the mind in every direction. Otherwise, narrow habitual concepts, they form the first world. Second, the bundle of associations, again mechanically, habitually formed. Then perceptions, with those associations I perceive some relationship, something similar, some pattern, and then the mix of the desires. This last part is what we often experience when we wake up in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, you wake up and suddenly something starts bothering you. Something somebody said in the day, some situation which is happening which is uncomfortable to you, and your mind starts brooding on it. And then you start going round and round. But why did he do this? How can he do this? How dare he? I will call him up. I will tell him this. I will do that. And you're going through a kind of a very strong emotional rut, unable to free yourself, getting yourself more and more disturbed. But if you stand back in the buddhi, you will see it's a round circle, which is completely silly, irrational, and even abnormal. You've exaggerated a small thing to become this huge problem, and it is entirely a bundle of emotions swirling with associated mix of senses. When you actually wake up from sleep in the morning, you look back at that and it makes no sense at all. But when you're in it, it seems like the only real thing, the only thing which matters. But it has the same pattern of eddying, swirling, and it is the portion where the emotions mix into the sense mind. Because you are in a half sleep state, the higher faculties of the mind, and especially the understanding and buddhi, are blocked. And so you are as if stuck in this. You're unable to free yourself. There are two possibilities when you find yourself stuck like that. One is wake up fully, splash water on your face, will yourself to wake up fully and break out of that cycle. What happens when you wake up fully? The faculty of understanding kicks in. The buddhi can stand back and shut it down. This is the easiest way. And then you go back to sleep. The cycle is broken. The other is to, whatever little buddhi you can bring into that state, you say, all this is an illusion, however much it may seem real to me right now. And I refuse to accept to participate in this. I reject this emotion. I reject this line of thinking. When I wake up, I will know how wrong it is, although now it seems real and true. I reject it now and put it to stop by a certain will. More difficult, but this is a good training, because then you train this layer. Your mind is stuck in this layer. You train this layer now to be brought under control and to teach it to become quiet. So all this is happening without any real sequence, order, or principle of light. What the higher faculty would do when it is thinking, there would be a logic to the sequence. It would put it in an order, meaningful. This is more important, this is less important. Structure all these ideas to put them in rightful place. And there will be some principle of light, some higher reference against which all this would fall into place. None of that exists in the functioning of the sense mind. So it is a constant repetition in a circle, unintelligent and unfruitful, leads nowhere finally. This description and the exact each word Sri Aurobindo uses is so accurate, so precise, and so complete in what it describes. So ordinarily, the human understanding accepts this undercurrent and tries to reduce it to a partial order and sequence. But by so doing, it becomes itself subject to it and partakes of that disorder, restlessness, unintelligent subjection to habit, and blind, purposeless repetition, which makes the ordinary human reason a misleading, limited, and even frivolous and futile instrument. So the problem is, we accept this normal functioning and then try to bring it into some kind of order. This is what happens during the normal state of the mind's working when we are doing nothing in particular. So, as an exercise, observe your mind when you're walking from one place to another on the road, or you're cycling, or you're driving, with nothing particular to preoccupy your mind. And try to observe what happens actually in your mind. You'll find these undercurrents, driftings, but you'll also notice something is trying to bring an order, give it direction, give it meaning. And in the process, you are sucked into this meaningless activity. If in the middle of such a process, you stop somebody and say, "What were you thinking?" The fellow tries to remember, and in the very act of standing back to observe, he has already lost the thread. And he says, "I don't know, I don't remember." The moment you're surprised, you stand back in the buddhi, lower buddhi, and the moment you've stepped out, the chain has stopped, it's broken. And you realize that you are not even conscious of the chain. At best, you catch the last part and you can pick a few fragments. Oh, I was thinking about this. What were you thinking? I don't know. The mind was just wandering around meaninglessly. And 5 seconds later, you would have been thinking of something totally different. This state of immersion in this wandering mind is the normal human state of minds working. It's only when we challenge ourselves, you're given a problem, solve a problem, do this, set right, arrange this, then the mind tries to bring some direction and purpose. These undercurrents may still go on, but they are pulled a little more to be more cohesive around this immediate functioning. Now imagine how much of the mind's energy and capacity is wasted. If all that functioning could be quieted, if all that power of the mind was channeled to a very specific intention, clearly structured and guided by the buddhi, you could think of so many interesting ideas. You could think of so many interesting things. In fact, draw out enormous number of insights, discover so many new things which you had never thought about, which could change the quality of your life. But it's all wasted. I found during a certain period when training the mind to not wallow in this sense mind, but to actively think from the buddhi, I found that even in the middle of a very ordinary activity, let's say I'm traveling with somebody, we're discussing something, the eyes look out from the car, we're in a car, we look out, and we notice this flyover. The senses notice the traffic flow and the fact that we are jammed. The sense mind observes all this. The intelligence proper can analyze the flow of the traffic and the arrangement of the flyover and say, this was not the most efficient arrangement. If the flyover had been made like this, it would have been much more efficient. You would have used half the amount of brickwork, the flyover would have been shorter, less expensive, and the traffic flow would have been freer. Now, this is all actually happening in the middle of a conversation while you're discussing something else and traveling. Just a glimpse, the sense mind provides some data and the intelligence operates on the data and finds something interesting. If you train your mind like this to stand back and not be immersed in the wanderings of the sense mind, you'll find almost moment to moment you observe something. Here's interesting, here's an insight, here's an insight. I could do this differently. And suddenly the world becomes so interesting. There's so many things to do, so many things to try out, so many things to explore, so many new ideas. And still, this is an activity of the intelligence. There will be a higher function to which Sri Aurobindo will lead us within another page and a half, where this intellectual activity of the mind will be taught to become silent and the faculty of intuition will open. And then as the mind, sense mind observes something, the intuition flashes. It observes something else, the intuition flashes. And you gain insights into things. A person passing by, there's an insight into what's happening in him. You look at a situation, there's an insight upon this and another. A series of flashes of intuitions as you go along, which is even more fascinating because you're learning things, you have new knowledge, you're learning, and because of it is intuitive, it becomes a part of you. It is a much deeper kind of knowledge. Now, all of this is possible for all of us just by teaching the sense mind to become silent and the intellect proper to stand back and apply its free power of thinking. But when we are stuck in that, it is completely a subjection to purposeless, unintelligent subjection to habit and purposeless repetition. And the state of the sense mind is this disorder and restlessness, which makes the ordinary human reason a misleading, limited, and even frivolous and futile instrument, but only because of the mixture of the sense mind. There is nothing to be done with this fickle, restless, violent, and disturbing factor but to get rid of it. So, how do you get rid of it? By two options: by detaching it and then reducing it to stillness, or by giving a concentration and singleness to the thought by which it will of itself reject this alien and confusing element. So the first approach is to detach, separate this purposeless, chaotic activity of the sense mind, reduce it to stillness, will it to become quiet, and then it stops. Or you have an activity, you have a purpose, and so all of the mind is directed towards that. There is a concentration, one pointedness of the thought, and the sense mind is pulled along, and the restlessness of it is to that extent reduced. If you have worked on the first, training the sense mind to become silent, the second becomes easier and more effective. So, as an exercise, what this means is we actually sit down and actively work to quiet the sense mind, quiet all the thoughts, quiet all the associations of that the senses throw upon in the mind. Just observe this is what it is. That's it. No associations, no ideas, no habitual concepts or perceptions or desires to follow. This is all. And you bring the whole sense mind to stillness. In the beginning, you will find it strenuous, you will find it difficult to hold this state. And so you relax, rest, and the state of rest is once again to let the mind start wandering. And after a while, you notice you don't like this. You again make it quiet. And then when you relax, again it starts wandering, but less agitated. And then again you make an effort and it becomes quiet. And this time when you relax, you find the quietness continues. Once you've got to this point, very quickly you'll find there is greater rest in stillness than in the activity. And now the activity of the sense mind, this mechanical, chaotic activity, is tiring. And one day you notice, why is my mind tired? Oh, my mind had lapsed back into this mechanical activity. And I quiet it, I come back to this stillness and rest, and I'm fresh again. So, to begin with, our mind, the sense mind and its chaotic activity, finds rest in its habitual chaos. To become quiet is tiring. But later, the reverse happens. To be in restless activity is tiring, and to be quiet is refreshing. When we've got to that, then pretty much the rest of the work becomes easier. So this is stilling of the sense mind and teaching the understanding to disengage from the senses and correct them or overpass them. And then the third cause of impurity is in the understanding itself, in the way we try to know. But before we take that up, we can just pause here and see if there's anything someone would like to share or any questions. Yes. Yes. Right. 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 That's why he puts this sequence. First cause of impurity is the intermittence of desire. But then the second cause is the sense mind. So it's only when you have taught your emotions to become quiet, then you observe, oh, the sense mind has its own issues, and then you can work on that. But so much of this is also habit. Training these parts to have a new habit. So you have to keep persisting until eventually they get used to it and then they begin to enjoy it. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Yes, unfortunately, when you observe people arguing, so much of the argument is sentimental argument. It's not even rational. And that's why eventually people just start getting angry and they start shouting because you're trying to assert an emotional impulse rather than a clarity of thought. Modern education, in fact, should take into account all these things as part of the training. And if all these were made deliberately part of the structure of our school education, imagine what an advantage we would have for the rest of our life. In fact, if you think of it, the whole yogic process is nothing but training of our whole nature, layer by layer, part by part. And all of that should be normally incorporated in our school education, at least the basics pointing to the higher possibilities. If that's there as your starting point. When I was about 10, because I was listening to Panditji's lectures, many of these things were part of my world. And we used to have the morning concentration in the school, 5 minutes of music which was played. And after initially, of course, children are just sit there, they become quiet and the mind wanders, and that's all that happens. So after a few days, I said, why am I just sitting like that? I should try to silence my mind. Because the idea was there that one can silence the mind. But most children are not even aware of that. So I began to practice silencing the mind at the age of 10. And I found after a few days or weeks of effort, I was able to hold my mind in absolute silence for about 20 seconds. But it was so strenuous, I would tire of it. But that was very good training practice. And then I found other ways to silence without the strain and all that stuff. But the exercise began at the age of 10 only with the idea that, well, it's possible. And then it should be, if it's possible, I should be able to do it. And it has always been for me a point of interest. What if all students were told these things much sooner? Wouldn't they start experimenting on their own? So, where I had an opportunity, I was teaching students earlier at the age of 10, 11, just that same age, when the mind is beginning to form to come into its own. Before that, it's still a more semi-emotional mind. So I would throw in certain suggestions. Oh, it's possible to do that. You can try this and see how they responded. And I found generally that they were very open, and some of them would tend to follow through. Some would try for a while and then drop it. And it had to do with their temperament. But still, one could have made it a discipline. One could actually go through certain exercises to train the mind in these ways. It was not in the scope of my class, so I did not pursue it. But I saw how valuable it would be for them. Yes. Yes. I had heard in the lectures that we had to learn to silence the mind and things like that. Yes, so what I tried was I tried to stop my thoughts. That's all. No technique that I knew of. I just knew that it's possible to stop your thoughts. So I have to be able to do it. So can I just stop thinking? And then the thought comes, I'm thinking. I'm not thinking. That thought itself has to be stopped. So it's tricky. This part is easy. Most people can do it for a while, for a short while. Yeah. That's the thing. That's the thing. I think it's possible to do it at an much earlier age. Perhaps it may not be possible for all 10-year-olds, but for many it will be possible, and for the others, it will be possible within a year or two. There's a point of maturity of the mind where the mind begins to stand back and can observe itself. That's the point where many of these things become easy. Yes. 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 So there are some methods we can use like this, where the attention of the mind is brought to an image, like a light in the head, or just becoming aware of the mind itself, and the thoughts just stop during the time that you hold that awareness. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes. And then it's a question of building a habit for the mind to remain like this. I found, for example, though, even at much later age, I trained my mind to become quite quiet. I won't say absolutely silence, but quiet, still mostly. I could hold that for hours. But certain kinds of activities or certain emotional states would bring a disturbance, and then it would not go back by habit. I had to make an effort to recover and re imprint the habit to remain quiet. And then again, it would stay quiet long enough until a certain emotional state disturbed it. So it was a question of separating the emotions. But all of these experiments are so interesting when you start playing with your mind's possibilities. Mhm. Yes, if we teach our mind to become silent and stay silent, we'll lose the power of thinking. Yes. You see, the point is when you teach your mind to become silent, you have the power to think when you want and not think when you don't want. You don't lose the power of thinking, rather, you gain control over the power of thinking. Then you can choose to think when you want, and you can choose to think clearly rather than in this haphazard, mixed, confused way. Right now, when you try to think about something, there's this whole intermittence of all these layers which rush in, and there's a bundle of chaos, and then something pops up, something emerges, something is half fragmented. You catch that and say, okay, I have an idea. But when all this is cleared and the whole mind is made silent, you choose to think, and the whole mind moves one pointedly in a clear, organized way. A thought is thought with clarity, with completeness. It knows its limits and then can break beyond its limits. It's much more powerful. It is, I have used this word, force multiplier. See, in my educational training, I had pointed this out to the teachers. I said, if you train your mind to become silent, your power of thought actually amplifies because silence of mind is a force multiplier. In itself, it does not affect your thought. but it amplifies the power of thinking itself, because the energy which would otherwise be dissipated in chaos and bringing confusion, that energy is now directed and the confusion is removed. You can actually think more profoundly. Your insights are more complete, more deep, and so on. This will be part of the discussion in the rest of the chapter, where Sri Aurobindo says all this training, that after we remove the third cause of impurity, you've still trained and purified the lower buddhi. To train the higher buddhi, you have to train the mind to become silent. And that is somehow disturbing for the modern mind, because we have put the thinking power as our highest power. And now we are being taught to stop that. It sounds scary. It feels strange. I was reserving some examples of that later, but since you have raised this point, there's this incident which Sri Aurobindo narrates, where somebody came to him and said that he wanted to learn to meditate. So Sri Aurobindo said, okay, sit down. And then he went on reading the newspaper. Sri Aurobindo obviously brought his force on the man and brought his mind to silence. After a while, this man got very restless and agitated. He said, I can't think. I can't think. I'm going mad. I'm going mad. And he got up and ran away. And Sri Aurobindo comments that it is typically the response of a mind which is not yet ready. When I've had other experiences with people, when suddenly they experience this stunning silence of the mind, they find themselves unable to think when the silence is so intense. And sometimes, if they're not used to it, they get restless. And then they have to actually do something to get their mind back to activity, and then they're comfortable. Okay, I'm back to normal. There are other people who are more ready. They experience this stunning mind, and then they ask, is this how it's supposed to be? They don't get restless, but they start asking, because it's not yet a habit. They don't yet know where it's going. Is this how it's supposed to be? And if you say, yes, this is good, okay, and they can accept it. And that's the difference of readiness. So there are two parts to the readiness. Just the understanding that to have a quiet mind is good is one part. And then the other is to feel good about it when it's silent. Yes. You know, if you speak of natural course, humanity has been following natural course for millions of years. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes. So the point is, what is slow enough or what is fast enough? So we recognize there's a need to accept that the mind has its own need, a pace, but as fast as possible within its capacity would be good, because we have so much more to do after that. Yes. Yes, of course, of course. So there is a limit. It's the elasticity of the mind. This is how I find it natural to describe. When the mind is not plastic enough, you can't reshape it too quickly, because like elastic, it snaps back. If you stretch too much, it can get injured. So you have to push a little bit, push again, stretch its elasticity until it gets used to it, and then help it gradually to change and so on. Yes, yes. But in the integral yoga, the process itself can be enormously speeded up if you bring into it not just your personal effort, but the help of the mother's force. If you can bring her silence and her light into your mind, the mind just becomes quiet. And if the substance of her light seeps into the mind, from inside it softens it and even imprints into it the new habit. And so very quickly, sometimes even within a few days, at most a few weeks, you can bring the habit of silence of mind. You can develop it. Then it may still need a lot of culturing to allow that state to continue in all activity. But at least you will find you're able to bring that silence of the mind when you become quiet and consciously intend it. and bring yourself to a certain state. you know, in in the domain of physics, they were trying to find, in the early days, they were trying to find some fundamental particle from which everything is built. They came down to three particles: protons, electrons, neutrons. And then they found these are built of others. And then as they go deeper, it's like a zoo of now hundreds of particles. But all those particles get a certain character of mass from something which to this day we don't know. What gives the sense of mass? So they speculate that there is a particle which gives all of them the sense of mass. This would solve the problem which has been bothering them for so long that they called it God particle. It has nothing to do with God. It is only a speculation. But since the whole of physics has focused on finding a particle to serve that function, eventually they will find it. But the particle will be unstable and not of a fixed form, as happens to all the subatomic particles. The truth is that the universe is not made from particles. It is made from a continuously flowing force. But if you're looking for a particle, when the force comes and does its thing, you will catch that process and measure it as a particle, and you will say there is a particle. It's your perception, the sense perception, which has blinkered itself to look only what passes within the bandwidth of a particle, within the perception of a particle. Although the truth may be beyond particle. So that's the game of physics currently. So we can surely say they will find such a particle, but it will not be a particle that they can easily capture because it is not really a particle, it's something else. Yes, exactly. Yes. So of course it has nothing to do with God, it has nothing to do with the spiritual. No. See, again, Big Bang is just a theory. That's one day the universe just exploded into creation. Now, the problem with this theory is you can't describe what happens before. Why did it explode into creation? Why did it explode in this way and not any other way? And what was before? Which makes no sense. The question makes no sense because space and time don't exist until the universe is born. So the whole thing is a speculative theory. The reality of observation of the universe does not fit this theory. So the theory of Big Bang itself is constantly undergoing modifications to make the theory fit what is observed. So the universe as it appears is much more evolved than if there was a Big Bang in the date that they consider. The only way to explain this is to say soon after the Big Bang, in 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second, there was a huge inflation and the universe spread out to become pretty much what it is today. Now that's just a theory again. Because your first theory failed, you added over it one more theory. Why did the inflation take place? Why did it take on this form? Nothing. Okay, so after that, we find again certain facts don't fit the theory. So again, the theory is modified that after the inflationary universe, something else happened which created these things. You're just creating layers and layers of speculation to make a theory survive. When in fact, the truth is, if you do not go by speculation but just by the hard facts, it seems as if the universe is an eternal reality. There was no Big Bang origin or Big Crunch ending. It is something which is being constantly created and recreated. And there are parts in the universe which are enormously old, and next to it, there are parts which are very young because new matter is coming into creation constantly. This is the spiritual truth of things. So there was never a time when the universe was not. The universe itself may undergo change of form and densities, but it will always be, it was always, because it is an aspect of the divine himself in his most dense self-expression. Yes, yes. So there's a very interesting exercise you could do when you are sleepy. Of course, it depends what you want to do. One exercise, and there I'll suggest some other things also. One exercise is to train a part of the mind to stand back from the sleepiness and remain in a meditative state. So you may bring the idea of the closeness with the Divine Mother, or feel in your heart the closeness with the Divine Mother, and will that this awareness should remain. So it's not necessarily a part of the intellect, but a part of the awareness which stands back from the sleepiness and holds a relationship with something deeper or higher, or just your deepest aspiration. You hold that, or just hold the image of the presence deep within you as the psychic being or the presence of the Divine Mother, something which relates to a deeper spiritual core or truth. You hold and try to retain that as far as possible as the rest of you drifts into sleep, and hold the intention that you will wake up with this part still intact. So if you persist in this, it takes a little while depending on cases, but after a while you'll find as you wake up, the memory of this point or this effort which you made is there simultaneously as you are waking up. You will realize, oh, this center which was meditating on the mother or concentrating on this, it's still there. And so you have an entry point, you have an exit point, and then gradually the thread connecting in between will develop more and more. And a day will come when, in reference to this thread, you will be able to recall even your dreams, and perhaps even all the dreams in sequence through the night. That part is a different exercise to remember the dreams, but at least the continuity of the thread, if it is made, then Mother says you can continue your sadhana even into the night, holding just the aspiration for the divine, holding the aspiration or the awareness of the connection with the psychic being, or whatever it is. Just that remaining through the night means you have not wasted the night. And the tendency which we have that after a beautiful spiritual experience in the day, we go to sleep and we wake up and we have lost it all, that will vanish, because the thread will continue and you will be able to retain that spiritual state developed, and you can build upon it over days. And you will recall experiences of the early sadhaks who used to have this experience that day to day, the intensity and the depth of the spiritual experience was being built up. That kind of things can start happening. So, this is one exercise. I have met a friend from the Ramakrishna Mutt tradition. He is now perhaps in his 60s. And he said he had consciously cultivated this ability, and for the last many decades, all his nights, he is able to retain the continuity of this thread of awareness. So, this is one exercise you could use for the night. The second exercise would be to try to remember dreams and go backwards to recall the dreams in sequence. A third exercise would be to will yourself to go to a certain state or world to experience that domain. So in the night, you will find yourself in that domain and you experience it, and you can will yourself to become conscious in your sleep, that you're conscious that you're dreaming, and then you take control of the dream, and then it's a fascinating experience. You can do pretty much anything you like. It's like you can shape reality as you will. You want a wall to be created here, you can just will a wall. You want it to change color, you can will it to change color and play around like that, as they play with this idea in the movie uh, in Inception. Inception is the movie, right? You can actually do all that sort of thing. It's quite fascinating. That's another kind of activity you could develop. Or you could develop the skill of going out of the body consciously, projecting a part of your consciousness outside. So many kinds of exercises you could play with during the body's sleep. Yes. See, yes, yes. Two things happen. So the question is whether the body will get its rest if you do all this. Two things happen. One is if the activity itself is tiring, then after doing it for a while, you automatically choose to slide into sleep for whatever kind of rest it is. But there are other activities like the first one which I mentioned, where you hold the connection with your deeper aspiration. These actually help to rejuvenate the body. Your body is more fresh. You wake up with a clearer and fresher consciousness. The sleep itself becomes meditative. Yes. Yes. Sometimes what happens is, yes, a part of the consciousness, especially when we're studying something like this, a part of the consciousness tends to open to something higher. It becomes almost meditative. And the body, if it is not used to meditation, can get a little sleepy. Or if the body is tired, also, it can get a little sleepy. But there's something else where one registers still, and one goes into a kind of an interiorized state. During that time, everything is so clear. But afterwards, when you're more exteriorized, you wonder, well, what was it? I don't remember even now. Because there's a gap between the inner and the outer. No, I would say if some part of the inner being is receiving, it's a good thing. Because some part in you absorbs. You may not remember in the surface mind, but the thing itself is a part of you and it will pop up on its own when you need it. Yes. 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 Sometimes, and also in collective meditation, you go to sleep, and when the meditation ends, you pop up out of the sleep just at that time. So you felt it as sleep because your body went into a kind of a dullness, but obviously the inner consciousness did not sleep. It went into some deeper states, which the body is not remembering. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. But of course, if you can train yourself not to fall asleep, but stay on that edge where there's an awareness but also an interiorization, then the capacity develops to be interiorized and then to even function at a higher level of awareness. Yes. Yes. You know, when the consciousness rises above the mind and we're not used to it, there is a kind of a whiteout. It becomes stunned. And it is also a state which is very similar to sleep. If it sinks below, it blacks out in the subconscious. But if it rises higher, there's a kind of a stunning, which also sometimes registers as sleep in the body consciousness, but the inner parts experience something much higher and freer. And that's why it's necessary to persist and to bridge this gap and teach the body not to fall asleep. Then we have access now to this higher level and one can even begin to stay in it consciously. There's an exercise called Yoga Nidra. You're referring to that, where you relax the body part by part. So there are two objectives there. One is to have a relaxed sleep. You do that and then you go to sleep. It is Nidra, it is sleep. But the higher objective in the more advanced training of Yoga Nidra is not to go to sleep, but through this state of relaxation to disengage from the body consciousness and awaken into a higher consciousness. Then that becomes Yoga Nidra. These are gradations of samadhi. So Sri Aurobindo uses another term. He says swapna samadhi. It is a state in which on some superficial part of the consciousness there are dreams. Swapna is dream. And you have dreams going on in the normal sense, but the deeper part of your consciousness is awake in trance, either in the self or some higher planes of consciousness or whatever it is. So it is a samadhi, but with this part, the rest of the body consciousness or surface mind in something similar to conventional sleep, where the dreams could be going on. But you are not in them, you are in this deep state. So that's the kind of sleep that Sri Aurobindo had. He would go into a state of trance, and in the biology, perhaps in the surface mind, something would happen, dreams would happen. He even makes reference somewhere in one of the letters. He says, even now, occasionally he gets dreams where he's riding a horse in Baroda when he was, during the time when he was secretary there. Some of those images still come up. He says that's the nature of the subconscious. It retains things and throws them up later. But obviously, he was not in that dream. He was in that other state where he's still doing his spiritual work and all that. Mother had a very different approach. Initially, in her, she has a letter to Andre where she says that for the last 15 years, I have not slept at all. And there's a couch where she would sit. She had no bed of her own. She would sit on this couch and she would go into deep trance for 15 minutes. And she would go deep all the way to the Satchidananda and come back. And that was enough to give all the freshness she needed, and she would continue her work. So her sleep, so-called sleep, rest, trance was 15 minutes only, and she had no other sleep. Mhm. Yes, the worlds are the same, whether you approach them in the dream state in the vital world or after death. The difference, though, is this. When you approach them in the dream state, your consciousness is still largely rooted in the physical. So your perception of the worlds is a little diluted, and the free access to those worlds is also limited. Your consciousness is still attached to the body, habit, sensation. And then if something happens there which is dangerous, like you get a dangerous feeling, immediately your consciousness goes back to the physical, and the physical is like a fortress, mother says. You are protected. It's so dulling that that thing ceases to have an effect on you. But when you have left the body, your consciousness is now freed from the dulling effect of the gross body. At that time, you experience those worlds much more intensely and vividly because now that's your reality. And then, if you're attacked there, you have nowhere to go. You have to run away or find some other way of protecting yourself, etc. You're bare, exposed. Yes, everybody almost. Of course, you can experience those worlds vividly as you would out of when having dropped the body, but then the body goes into a semi-trance state. Then you have this out-of-body experience, etc. Otherwise, a small part of your consciousness projects. So let me give an analogy. The analogy would be if I see a river flowing, I'm on the shore, and I dip my fingers in the water. That's how we experience those worlds. So now if a big fish comes and starts biting, I pull my hands out. That's it. Nothing happened. I am still rooted on the ground outside the river. After death, you plunge into the water. You're in it. There's no escape. That's the difference. Yes, yes. Yes, yes. 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 So there are two limitations. One is limitation of your own awareness, which is not fully awakened in that world. It's not as fully master of it as you could be potentially. You're aware, but not yet fully into the awareness as a mastery. Okay, so you can try to intensify the awareness in that world. But the second limitation is what is happening from the nature of the world itself. So in the band of the vital, it's as if you're wielding the reality with your vital energy. So you can only do as much as vital energy can do. You're made of vital energy, things are of vital energy, your relationships are of vital energy. And that's all it is. But that also suggests to you that you could shift grades, shift to a new level where it becomes more mental. There are many degrees in that. And then the mental world experience is of a different kind. Your mind's visualization is what creates the reality. In the dream itself, it's like you will yourself to shift to the mental world. Just the intention, start with that. Yes, 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 yes. But all things are made of energy. And when you shift to the mental world, all things are made of thought substance. So the transition itself will be through grades, but the intention to shift to a higher level of mental awareness, the idea is enough to push you to that. So before you sleep, you can go with this intention that in the dream you will remember to will yourself to shift levels. Okay. The experience is often similar to what happens when you leave the physical body to enter into the vital. It's like you leave the vital body and get into the mental. The feeling is like that. It's like you let go and shift, pull yourself out into mental awareness of a mental level. Try this, I think. So so concept will be for you pulling out of this vital body itself into something more essential, into a mental body. It's like this body disengaged from the physical, and now from the subtle vital, you disengage another. So there you will find you can also go back in time. In the vital world, it's not as easy to go back in time. But in the mental world, you can actually go back and see many things. I think just this idea that you're shedding this body to separate out into a subtler body. See if you can work on this. Yes, it grips you because that's the nature of the emotional world. You are one with the emotion, it sucks you. Mm. Yes. The question is what happens during Nirvikalpa Samadhi where people are afraid they may not come back to the body. It's because of the nature of the experience of complete dissolution of all form. You see, for us it's difficult to conceive if you were somehow to dissolve all form, you still have an awareness of form. But there's a point of transition where even awareness of form is lost. Memory of form is gone. Okay? Yeah. So at that point, it feels as if you won't even remember how to get back to the world of form because the memory of form is fading away from you. That's when people panic. But the truth is this, that if you accept that you are there as well as here, you are not separate from this. You are only concentrating on an experience of yourself beyond the domain of form. Then you can accept to go into that, knowing that you will have what it needs to return when it's time to return. So one can, if with that trust, one can allow oneself to drift, even experience that, and then return. They say though that there is a point where from there you can choose to annul yourself. And then of course there's no coming back. But again, that's a choice. But the transition itself, on the border of that, when you're losing the sense of form, the danger is felt when the memory itself fades. You do not even know, the memory of the world goes, and then you don't know what will bring you back. Pardon? No, with this yoga, the experience of this kind is useful because it liberates you from the illusion of the world. It is still necessary as an experience, but we do not accept that as the goal. We accept that as a step of freedom after which you re-engage now from a poise of freedom. Mm. Yes, she has to have that. She has to have that. The complete annulling in order to be able to. Well, I would say you don't have to have that, but you cling to the mother, but then she may give you that experience. If it is when it is necessary in your journey, she will give you that experience. But it doesn't mean you will stay in that for a long time. Sometimes even an experience of that for a few seconds is enough to break the delusion of our identification with the world. What that is like is difficult to describe, but it means that after that, never again will you say this is real. This is all part of the game. The reality is something indescribable. Yeah, well, you are real. Your freedom is real after that. You are no more. You don't no more have that illusion of being entangled in the world. And then from that greater freedom, you are able to participate without fear and without the delusion. How the spirit becomes form. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Uh-huh. The vocabulary is unfamiliar, but the idea is very simple. But we can discuss that another time. He describes that in the Life Divine also, how the spirit becomes form, but using a different vocabulary which is more accessible to the modern mind. Mhm. So next time we will take up the third cause of impurity, which is after a gap of a few days. Just one moment. I'm sorry. Yes, so next Friday I will have to be out of station, and then we will resume this on June 5th. 3 weeks. We skipped 3 weeks. Sorry. Yes, I know. I'm sorry. Uh, we'll still have it on Sunday. I know. I know. This year has been more than I had wanted, but hopefully after that it won't be. Yes, very well. So we'll close this with the Sunday I'm here. We close this with chant of Om 5 times. Om. 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 Om.